Hey guys, Gaius at the Shelter Institute. We've been building timber frames for about 40 years and we've seen some stuff and done some interesting things. And we have a few stories to share with you that we hope might be helpful and inspiring as you start your own timber frame journey or start to think about your own timber frame journey. One job that stands out in particular was a build that we did in Malibu. So we're located on the East Coast in Maine, and this job obviously was out on the West Coast. Our customer was a past student at Shelter. She had taken the class in the 90s and expressed when she was here taking the class that she hoped to one day build on a piece of property that she owned in the Malibu hills. And I think we all took that with a grain of salt at the time, but it actually did happen. This job in Malibu took us approximately 10 years from the first time we met till the day that we showed up. And some of that were ancillary delays, but much of it was literally just getting through the building permit process. As a builder that works primarily in New England, we were introduced to whole sets of rules and regulations that we had no idea existed out in California. One of which is that you need to be a licensed general contractor in California in order to build. So one of the things that we did is fly out and sit for the general contractor's exam, pass it, luckily, so that we would be able to build the timber frame there. But there were just many other hoops that our customer had to jump through in order to be able to build out there. The customer found that it was less expensive to have a Maine builder fabricate a job here in Maine. The timbers had to be West Coast Doug fir, so we had to have those shipped to our shop here in Maine, truck it all the way across the country to the West Coast and raise it, then to hire a general contractor in California to build the timber frame. One of the biggest explanations for why it made sense fiscally is that labor from Maine is much less than labor in California, and while we were on site for 3 weeks, we spent 4 to 6 weeks here cutting the timber frame. So much of the labor took place right here in Maine. And then also because we own the truck and so on, the shipping costs were quite a bit lower to get the job out to California. And again, we brought our own crane. So when we arrived on site, the expense of finding and getting a crane on site was already avoided. The site was very difficult. It was up in the Malibu hills overlooking the Pacific Coast Highway. And we were concerned about being able to get a crane up to this job site, crane that we were familiar using and so on. So we'd actually decided to bring our own crane, and it was fairly convenient because we could load the timbers for the timber frame onto our truck and drive across the country. Due to our approach, I was unable to drive straight in. So the last 3/4 of a mile or so was backing the truck in, and this was on a very, very scary road to navigate on because it was a cut and fill type of situation. So it was a very steep slope, and the builders of the road had basically just cut into the hillside and pushed dirt off to the side. So on one side we had the mountain, and on the other, no guardrail and a very long drop off ultimately to the ocean. It was a beautiful sight. It was very hard to stay focused on the work because of the view that we had looking out over the Pacific Ocean. The SIPs were delivered to the job site, and there was no way that this tractor trailer was going to make it up the mountain to deliver onto the site. So after we got the timber frame unloaded, we arranged to meet the truck down at the bottom of the mountain. So we drove our straight truck all the way down, loaded SIPs onto it, and on one of the return trips ended up gouging one of our tires on a rock and cut through the sidewall and needed to have that repaired before we could drive back to Maine. And Blueberry was command central back here in Woolwich, and she found a place called Pinky's. And they showed up about an hour and a half after we put in the call that we had a flat tire and repaired the tire right on site. It was incredible. The building itself was relatively simple. It actually consisted of 2 20 by 20 timber frames that were separated by about 20 or 24 feet, and one of them had an ancillary shed sticking off the side that was for the washroom. The portion of the project that we did is very typical for us. So we raised the timber frames, we enclosed them both with SIPs on the walls and roof. We installed metal roofs on both buildings and then installed the windows and doors minus the garage doors in the garage. One of the other things that we did that was unique to us, because we typically build on the East Coast, is installing some Simpson shear walls on each side of the garage door, because there was not a lot of panel left to resist rack if there was a seismic event. So these consisted of 13-inch wide steel shear walls that were bolted directly into the foundation down below, and then up top they were bolted into the SIPs that ran over the top of the garage door opening, and that provided ample rigidity to prevent the building from collapsing in a seismic event. And that is an area where many builders overlook the structural requirements when building a garage. Obviously, you want to have a nice big garage door in the end of the building, and that does usually leave you with two thin ribbons of wall on each side of the door, and often it's not enough. You may have seen an older garage with a particular lean because there's just very little wall left on each side of the door. Another thing that we're a little unused to is inspections during the raising of the timber frame, raising and enclosing. Obviously, there are many inspections that take place in a typical build, but for the portion that we're involved in, usually we're able to arrive on the site, raise the timber frame, and enclose it, and leave before any inspections are actually required. But that was not the case in Malibu. We had to coordinate with the local building department for a total of 3 different inspections. What was frustrating about the inspections is that they always consisted of the building official looking at the plans and discussing what the plans called for, and there was never an actual inspection of the building itself. And on the third one, possibly out of a little bit of frustration, I asked the inspector if he wanted to look at what we had done, because we had worked very hard during the time that we were there to make sure that we had clearly followed all of the stipulations on the plans, most of them having just to do with the amount of nails into the SIPs. And the building inspector was willing to step out of the building, walk around the corner, briefly examine, and then left. So annoying. Every time what would happen is we would call, like the inspector, we called the inspector and gave him the address, and he told us exactly when he would be there. And the first inspection was supposed to happen on a Friday, and he just never showed up. He was supposed to be there at 11 o'clock rolled around, 12 o'clock rolled around. Finally, we called with very limited cell service, and were told that the inspector had gone out, couldn't find the site, and had left for the day. This was on a Friday. So we had a nice relaxing weekend. Some of the things that added time were the nailing schedule, whereas when we build in New England and we don't really worry about seismic events, obviously Malibu is a very, much of the design is driven by the seismic forces on the building. And the way to deal with that most typically is with extra nails. So whereas we might nail 6 inches on center here, the nailing pattern there was 2 inches on center, staggered and offset. So if we had a 1.5 inch wide piece of framing lumber to nail into, we would nail 3/8 of an inch from the edge and 3/4 of an inch from the edge back and forth every 2 inches. So we developed what we thought was a very creative system where we drilled holes in a piece of wood, laid it on the edge of the panel, and spray painted it. So we had a little dot exactly where every single nail would go. And this is why we wanted the building inspector to inspect, because it was perfect. One of the things you might take away from this story is whether or not it's practical to build in certain states. We certainly found California to be challenging, both in terms of the length of time it took, and I do think part of that had to do with the particular part of the state where we were building, and the other is just the expense. There were many expenses that existed in that build that simply don't exist in many other parts of the country. Of course, there are other factors to consider when you're looking at building and trying to figure out the feasibility of building, the expense of building, and so on. This particular site was very challenging because it was at a high elevation and access to the job site was very difficult. It was hard to find the site, it was hard to physically get to the job site, and it consisted of a very small plateau up in the hills. So getting to it was very challenging. Of course, once you got onto that plateau, it was absolutely stunning. And it's one of the things that saved it from the wildfires that ripped through that community. There were 3 other houses very close to this building that burned to the ground. But because this one was slightly isolated on the plateau, and because the exterior finishes were all non-flammable. The metal roof, obviously not flammable, and the siding was stucco, which also helped dramatically. Everything around that building was burned black, right to the ground. There was nothing left, including buildings that were around it. So that was one saving grace of that very difficult location, is that it protected it from the fires. Other things you might consider, though, are when you're looking at hiring a design build firm or an architect, is what they're able to offer to the project. Can they do everything for you? Are they only able to do some of the build? Obviously, we were operating from Maine. We were only able to do a portion of the build. We weren't able to do the usual engineering that we do for a build here in New England. In order to build in Malibu, you had to have a wet stamp from Malibu, an engineer located in Malibu. So that was not us. And then, of course, you want to look at the cost and availability of labor in your area. Does it exist? And what is the expense? It often, as this example proves, can be less expensive to bring labor in from a different location if it's practical. That's one of the nice things about a timber frame, is that it makes perfect sense to cut the timber frame off-site and then transport it. And that is one of the cost-saving mechanisms that really came into play in this particular build. If you're considering doing the entire project yourself, timber framing also is a natural choice, I believe, because if you buy a piece of property that has timber on it, there is nothing more efficient, meaningful, and enjoyable than being able to harvest trees off of your own property, and it's very practical to mill timbers into a timber frame. If you're building with 2x4s or 2x6s, you have so many pieces that you need to make, but if you're cutting a timber frame, it's very practical to get those timbers from trees on your own property. You eliminate all of the issues with trucking, transportation, and so on. So again, a timber frame can really make a lot of sense for you if you have a piece of property in an area that has trees that will work for a timber frame. So this is just one project in hundreds that we have done through the years. We bring the experience of all of those projects to every project that we process. So if you are looking for a little bit of help in your timber frame project, don't hesitate to reach out. Whether we're getting involved in cutting or not, we can often help with logistical issues, design, and frankly, just advice. Sometimes it's nice to be able to talk to someone that's been through that situation before, and sometimes we can help our customers get through a little bit more easily. If you're interested in learning how to timber frame, check out the link to our online timber framing course below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you at the next one. Hey guys, here at the Shelter Institute, we've been teaching people to design and build their homes since 1974, and we've been building timber frames for about 40 years. We design and build timber frames, we sell fine woodworking tools, we teach house building classes of many different types. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, check us out in person here at our store in Woolwich, Maine, or online at shelterinstitute.com.